Well, joining me now is Dr. Ira Kalish, who is the Chief Economist at Deloitte. Ira, thanks very much indeed for joining us. I've listened to you over the years at the National Retail Federation Conference and here at the World Retail Congress a number of times. Sometimes you're a purveyor of good news, sometimes you're a purveyor of bad news. I found it difficult to actually gauge from what you told us today at the Congress as to whether the road ahead is going to be rosy or whether the road ahead is going to be very perilous. What do you think?
A little bit of both, I guess. If you look at, say, the U.S. economy, which I talked about, right now it's in pretty good shape. It's getting a little bit of stimulus this year, so we might see a little bit better growth this year. But there are also some risks on the horizon from monetary policy, from trade policy, just from the fact that the economic recovery is fairly old. So a downturn is probably coming in the next 2 or 3 years. And that means that retailers, even though things are good now, are likely to face some challenges going forward.
Now, we hear various different pronouncements from the Trump administration, some formal, some via the new method of communication in terms of government policy, which is on Twitter. There seems to be a real protectionist momentum coming out. First of all, is that happening in reality? And if it does happen, is that really perilous to world economic growth?
It is happening. It's happening on a relatively modest scale so far. The words of the U.S. administration have not completely been matched by action yet, and there's some uncertainty as to whether that will be the case. But if we do wind up with a trade war in which the U.S. imposes substantial tariffs on other countries and they retaliate and the U.S. retaliates again, the end result could be a substantial deceleration in trade, an increase in prices, a loss of consumer spending power, a requirement that retailers and their suppliers redesign their supply chains, and certainly a loss of profitability for retailers and their suppliers. And most importantly, a loss of economic growth. So it is perilous, and it's worrisome because I believe, as do most economists, that the world economy and the retail industry especially have benefited greatly over the past several decades by the further liberalization of trade and capital flows. And while there are costs associated with that, they're relatively easy to deal with. That's where we should focus our attention on dealing with the cost, which is the people who are displaced by trade can be compensated because the winners outnumber the losers. So theoretically, the winners should be able to compensate the losers and let everybody be better off.
That's not a strategy that's talked about very much in the Trump administration. It seems to be very much one of protectionism. On the other side of that protectionism, I suppose, debate is China. Mm-hmm. Do you see sort of a constant action, retaliation action potential over the course of the next few months in terms of what's going on with China? And actually, who gains and who wins?
Well, I think China will retaliate when the U.S. acts, but China has a strong interest in retaining the system of global liberal trade. And in fact, the president of China has spoken about that lately, and China has taken some actions aimed at assuaging the concerns of the U.S. I think China stands to lose, as does any country, from restrictions on trade. On the other hand, China is less dependent on exports than it used to be, less dependent on the U.S. than it used to be, certainly less dependent on the kinds of low value-added products that might be the target of tariffs than it used to be. So China can withstand a trade war, although it certainly won't benefit from it. But I think the U.S. is playing a difficult game because it's not likely, it seems to me, that the U.S. will get China to substantially change its behavior in the way that it wants, just simply by imposing tariffs.
Now, most retailers watching this are looking around the world for growth. Mm-hmm. We've all got limited resources. Where would you suggest the focus of potential growth around the world will be for people to focus on?
Well, in terms of the dollar or euro volume of growth, it will still be the big markets like the US, Europe, China, Japan, even though the growth rates might not be that great. But if you're looking longer term at the markets that are likely to become much more important, I would look at some of the up and coming large emerging markets like India, Indonesia, Philippines, Colombia, some countries in Africa like Nigeria and Kenya, and some of the countries in the Middle East. But obviously the major countries are still very important, but I think it will make sense down the road for major retailers as they saturate the big markets to start looking at some of these other markets for possible growth in the future.
Now, you talked a little bit about Saudi Arabia. I think to most people that would have been a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
But interesting things seem to be going on there.
I think so. I think what the Crown Prince is doing is interesting. He's doing a number of things in terms of social liberalization, allowing women to drive, opening movie theaters, but also economic liberalization. The IPO of the state-run oil company, allowing more foreign investment into the country, both in the oil and non-oil sectors, encouraging tourists to visit. These are all things that will have a positive impact. It's interesting to me that in Saudi Arabia, there's been a big increase in investment in education for women. And in fact, a very large share of women there are studying so-called STEM topics, science, technology, engineering, and math. That suggests that down the road, there'll be a much bigger participation of women in the labor force, which should contribute to economic growth and certainly to the growth of modern retail.
Now, I can't let you go without, as a Brit, talking about Brexit. So don't blame me, I didn't vote for it. In the context of the world's global economy and the way in which you look at the economic movers and shakers around the world, is Brexit a sideshow or is it an important event in economic development?
It's a very important event for Britain. And Britain is a very large economy. It's the 5th or 6th largest in the world, but it's still relatively small compared to the rest of the world. So even though I believe that Britain is facing a significant challenge and may face much slower economic growth than would otherwise have been the case, I don't think that will have much of a spillover effect on other countries. In fact, if anything, some European countries may actually benefit from Brexit if investment in industries that used to take place in Britain, looking to Britain as a gateway to the rest of Europe, now takes place in, say, Spain or Germany or wherever else in Europe. I think the outlook for Britain is worrisome. It's the only major economy in Europe that has not seen an acceleration in economic growth lately. It's seen a deceleration. And it's not entirely surprising because after Brexit, there was a sharp drop in the value of the pound that raised import prices, created inflation, reduced consumer purchasing power, led to weakness of retail sales, and then the uncertainty of Brexit is likely having a chilling effect on business investment. So I don't know how it's going to end, and how it ends is very important.
Yes.
So we'll have to wait and see.
We're told that it's likely that the Trump administration would fast track a trade deal with the UK. Do you see any signs of that?
I don't see any signs. I've heard that sort of talk, but negotiating even a bilateral deal between the US and UK will take a long time. These are complicated things. Trade agreements usually take between 5 and 10 years to negotiate. So before the UK
and that's not just slowness of the way in which governments work. Fundamentally, it's complex. It takes time to work through.
Exactly. It's a very complicated process. I mean, if you look at the recent trade agreement between Canada and the European Union, or between Japan and the European Union, both negotiations took the better part of a decade. So even if Britain ultimately gets free access to the US market, it's going to take a long time before that actually happens.
Last question, Ira. If you're a retailer sitting in the boardroom, you're looking at the future, next few years, should you be smiling or should you be sort of crying into your teacup?
Well, I recall there was an executive who was the CEO of Intel years ago who said something to the effect that success comes from being paranoid.
Yes, yes,
so,
yes. Only the paranoid survive, I think.
Right,
Andy Grove.
Right, Andy Grove, that's right. So I like that philosophy. Even when things are good, that's when you have to be worried because something is lurking around the corner. So regardless of whether the economic situation is positive or negative, any executive in any business, whether it's retail or something else, has to always be aware of what challenges and risks lurk around the corner and start preparing for that.
Dr. Ira Kalish, the Chief Economist of Deloitte, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much indeed for watching. If you've enjoyed this, there's plenty more. All you need to do to make sure that you get the latest videos when they're released is just push this subscribe button to subscribe to our YouTube channel.